Hello students, welcome to this present video segment. In this segment we are going to do on the modern element in literature by Matthew Arnold. This is an essay written by Matthew Arnold. It was actually a kind of a lecture which was delivered in 1857, and the brief introductory part tells us when and where it was delivered. What follows was delivered as an inaugural lecture in the Poetry Chair at Oxford. It was never printed, but there appeared at the time several comments on it from critics who had either heard it or heard reports about it, etc., etc. He will go on to talk about many aspects of this lecture. We'll take it from the middle of this paragraph. The inaugural lecture, however, treating a portion of the subject where my knowledge was perhaps less insufficient, and where beside my hearer were better able to help themselves out from their own knowledge, is here printed. No one feels the important imperfections of this sketchy and generalized mode of treatment more than I do. So he considers the essay, or he considers the treatment, to be sketchy and generalized. And not only is this mode of treatment less to my taste now than it was 11 years ago, but the style too, which is that of the doctor rather than the explorer. So these are the 2 points which are important for us. He considers this imperfect in the sense that it is sketchy. It only consists of outlines and it's extremely generalized. And he also considers that the approach has been of one who is dealing something from a morphological point of view, from an anatomical point of view, and not from someone who is actually exploring. I'm tempted to institute a comparison over here. Aristotle's Poetics and Horace's Ars Poetica, if you read them, we are over here reading a very early exponent of comparative literature. And if you take Aristotle's Poetics and Horace's Ars Poetica side by side, and if you read them, you will notice that Aristotle's attitude is that of the explorer, while Horace's is that of a doctor. Aristotle is, reporting what he is seeing. It's something that he is observed. It's a result of his observations. This is followed. This is generally done. While in case of Horace, because it's a letter to his students, it's much more direct, like a doctor's prescription. Do this and don't do that. So we would not fully agree with Arnold in these aspects that this is imperfect in that it is sketchy and it is generalized, and the style is that of diagnosis and prognosis rather than of discovery. But we should remember that these are the things that he actually doesn't like. Maybe they are not so much in the essay, but these are the things that he is trying to transcend from. And there is another important aspect in this particular essay, in this particular paragraph towards the end of it. Nevertheless, having written much of late about Hellenism and Hebraism, and Hellenism being to many people almost an empty name compared with Hebraism, I print this lecture with the hope that it may serve, in the absence of other and fuller illustrations, to give some notions of the Hellenic spirit and its works, and of their significance in the history of the evolution of the human spirit in general. Now, Arnold was called a Hellenist. But before going into all these things, we have to first see what is Hellenism and Hebraism. And as we would enter into the remaining parts of the essay, we will see how Hellenism has been put forward over here as a kind of a ideology that Arnold supports. Now, Hellenism is a kind of a, you can say, a mixture of different philosophical ideas, the different schools of thought which came into being in the Hellenistic period of Greek civilization. What is this? Which is this Hellenistic period? It's a period in history between the death of Alexander, which is 323 BC, and the period when Augustus achieved supremacy. So this period is called the Hellenistic period, and it's very difficult to boil the beliefs and thoughts down to a set of these because of the representative thoughts of the Hellenistic period, because it combined the philosophical systems that contributed to the Hellenistic thought are wide and diverse. Hellenism or Hellenistic ideas consisted of the ideas of sophists, the ideas of cynics, and it's also deeply influenced by Platonism, by Epicureanism, and also by Stoicism. You know, Epicureanism and Stoicism are poles apart. And also by Neoplatonism. But what we see as a kind of a general tendency of this Hellenistic thought, it's very difficult, as I've told you, to boil it down to one or a few particular traits. But what we see is a kind of a shift towards individualism during this Hellenistic period, a kind of a shift towards individualism when it comes to philosophy, a shift towards humanism. The most effectual of these philosophical faiths was that of sophists. And if you know anything about sophists, if you have read Oedipus Tyrannus, then you are already conscious about Sophocles over there is actually reacting against the sophists, particularly their chief Protagoras. Now, if you know what the sophists mean and what the sophists try to establish, man is a measure of all things is a very important, well-known dictum by Protagoras. Now, you know that it's a kind of a movement that is slowly tilting towards what we today call humanism. And he talks about Hebraism as well. And he talks about the kind of a comparison between Hellenism and Hebraism. Nevertheless, I'm reading this part again. Having written much of late about Hellenism and Hebraism, and Hellenism being to many people among an empty name compared with Hebraism, now we know it's not an empty name for us. We know that Hellenism is what kind of a movement it is, and it can be made to boil down, which is very absurd, but still, for academic sake, if we want to boil it down to one particular characteristic, then it would be a shift towards individualism or a shift towards humanism. On the other hand, there is Hebraism. Hebraism developed among the same time in the same time in what we call the Middle East today. The Hebraic civilization and its basic ideology is Jewish monotheism. Okay, it's more theocentric, and one very important aspect of Hebraism is the way it will build the foundation for the Messiah, the messianic foundation, the Messiah, the anointed one, the prophet whose appearance which has been so much predicted in the Old Testament. So you can understand the difference between Hellenism and Hebraism. Hellenism is more, now to come down to the single point, Hellenism is more a shift towards individualism, towards humanism, while Hebraism is a shift towards towards religion, towards messianism, towards theology. So Arnold was always in favor of Hellenism, and his purpose, as he says, I print this lecture with the hope that it may serve, in the absence of other and fuller illustrations, to give some notion of the Hellenic spirit and its works. Is to kind of make a kind of a display of what is Hellenism. Now he begins with a story, and it makes whatever it is, a lecture or an essay, interesting if we begin that with a story. Here the story is quite significantly from Oriental civilization, from Oriental lore, and we will read the entire story. We'll read the entire first paragraph to understand it. It is related in one of those legends which illustrate the history of Buddhism, that a certain disciple once presented himself before his master, Buddha, with the desire to be permitted to undertake a mission of peculiar difficulty. The compassionate teacher represented to him the obstacles to be surmounted and the risks to be run. Purna, so the disciple was called, insisted and replied with equal humility and adroitness to the successive objections of his advice. Satisfied at last by his answers of the fitness of his disciple, Buddha accorded to him the desired permission and dismissed him of his task with these remarkable words nearly identical with those with which he himself is said to have been admonished by a divinity at the outset of his own career. Go then, O Purna, are his words. Having been delivered, deliver. Having been consoled, console. Having arrived thyself at the farther bank, enable others to arrive there too. Of course, it's about a kind of a spiritual arrival, about a spiritual enlightenment. But what does this story tell us? The story stresses on the importance of the experience of the individual before actually that individual is going to deliver something. One has to experience deliverance first before he goes on to preach about deliverance. This is the idea. It was a moral deliverance. Obviously, it's a spiritual. He calls it a moral one. It's more spiritual than moral, obviously. But in Victorian England, there's hardly much difference between these terms. It was a moral deliverance, eminently, in which the great Oriental reformer spoke. It was a deliverance from the pride, the sloth, the anger, the selfishness. Look at the language, vibrant, almost poetic. You must remember that Matthew Arnold was also a celebrated poet, which impaired the moral activity of man. A deliverance which is demanded of all individuals and in all ages. But there is another deliverance for the human race, hardly less important, equally important, so to say. Indeed, than the first, for in the enjoyment of both united consists man's true freedom, but demanded far less universally, and even more rarely and imperfectly obtained. Now we come to a very important part. A deliverance neglected, apparently hardly conceived in some ages, while it has been pursued with earnestness in others, which derive from that very pursuit their peculiar character, this deliverance is an intellectual deliverance. So he draws a parallel between intellectual deliverance and moral deliverance, or what he calls moral deliverance or spiritual deliverance. He draws a parallel between the two and considers both important. Intellectual deliverance, according to him, is no less important than spiritual deliverance. And what does he mean by intellectual deliverance? We have already come to the end of this segment. In the next segment, we'll see this. Thank you.